The wedding feast shimmered under candlelight, gold goblets raised high, and music swelling through the hall with all the majesty befitting a union of power. To the gathered nobles, it was a night of beauty, romance, and triumph. The Duke, one of the most influential men of his age, had taken for himself a bride whose grace and charm seemed unmatched. She moved through the hall with a smile that caught every eye, a vision of refinement draped in silks and pearls. Yet hidden within the carefully crafted decorations was a secret so grotesque, so chilling, that not even the boldest court gossip could have imagined it. Among the roses, the garlands, and the ribbons were strands of hair, real hair, human hair, taken not from maidservants or wig-makers, but from women who had once stood as rivals for the Duke's affection and who now lay silenced forever. The hall glittered with celebration, but in the shadows of that magnificence lay a story soaked in blood. It is from this moment that the tale begins, not with the laughter of the noble guests, nor with the vows whispered between bride and groom, but with the silent screams of the women whose lives were cut short. The decorations that adorned the room were more than ornaments. They were trophies, tokens of conquest that spoke not of love, but of violence and possession. The bride's hands, delicate in their movements, bore no outward trace of the crime she had committed. Yet those who dared to look too closely at the braided garlands might have noticed something unsettling. The texture, the unnatural glint under candlelight, the faint suggestion that these strands once belonged to living, breathing women. To understand how such horrors came to be displayed openly in a hall filled with the most powerful figures of the time, we must first recognize the duality that defined this world. On the surface lay the elegance of nobility, courtly manners, lavish gowns, political marriages meant to secure dynasties. Beneath it, however, pulsed envy, rivalry, and the raw hunger for control. Within this society, every smile could conceal betrayal, and every whispered promise might carry the seeds of destruction. It was within this dangerous game of appearances that the bride thrived, her ambition sharp as a blade. Her story is not one of madness born overnight. It is the slow burn of obsession, the transformation of love into possession, of insecurity into rage. This woman, who outwardly embodied refinement and charm, harbored within her the will to strangle, to silence, and to keep pieces of her victims as if they were relics of her victories. The wedding, far from being a union of hearts, became the stage for her ultimate display of dominance, not only over her rivals, but over the very narrative of love and beauty itself. She did not hide the evidence of her crimes. She showcased them in plain sight, daring anyone to recognize the truth. For the unsuspecting guests, the night would remain remembered as a dazzling celebration. For those who dare to peel back the layers of illusion, however, it stands as one of the most macabre spectacles in history. This is the story of a bride whose love was laced with violence, whose devotion turned deadly, and whose wedding became a shrine to the women she had destroyed. It is a tale that forces us to question the thin veil that separates elegance from horror, romance from obsession, and beauty from death. And it begins with that hall of flickering candles, that shimmering display of hair, and the chilling silence of the victims whose voices would never again be heard. The bride who would one day shock the court with her macabre trophies was not born into a world of horror. She was born into a world of ambition, where beauty, charm, and cunning were as valuable as land or gold. From her earliest years, she learned that to survive in the treacherous waters of nobility, one had to wear masks, of innocence, of obedience, of affection, while beneath the surface cultivating the sharpest instincts. She was not the daughter of a mighty dynasty, but neither was she obscure. Her family, though respectable, stood on the edge of influence, and her marriage prospects were never her own to decide. For a girl of her station, life was a game of strategy, and her most powerful weapon would be her allure. The noble courts of Europe in this era were dens of both splendor and danger. Painted ceilings, jeweled gowns, and feasts of unimaginable wealth dazzled visitors. But behind each display was a contest of survival. Marriage was not a union of love. It was a transaction, a battle fought with whispered words and veiled smiles. Women were expected to be submissive, yet paradoxically, they were also judged on their ability to capture attention, secure alliances, and produce heirs. Rivalry among noblewomen was fierce, and beauty was both a blessing and a curse. To be admired was to be envied. To be chosen was to become the target of all those overlooked. It was in this setting that the young woman who would become the Duke's bride discovered her own hunger. She had watched older sisters and cousins discarded by suitors or humiliated by rivals who outshone them in courtly graces. She resolved never to meet such a fate. Every gesture she perfected, her dance, her smile, her carefully measured gaze, was designed to captivate and conquer. To win the Duke's notice was no accident. It was the culmination of years of calculated charm, each compliment offered at the right moment, each coy glance delivered with precision. By the time he declared his affection, she had already ensnared him. But winning his heart was only half the battle. The Duke was a man of wealth and power, and with such a man came a swarm of rivals. Courtesans, maidens of other noble families, and ambitious women from across the region saw him as a prize worth fighting for. For them, the Duke was not just a man. He was security, influence, and the possibility of ruling at his side. For the bride, however, he was far more. He was an obsession. To her, the Duke was not only a partner but a possession, one that no other woman had the right to touch, admire, or even dream of. This obsession grew in the fertile soil of her insecurities. Despite her outward confidence, she feared that her charms might one day fail. Beauty fades, affections wander, and in courts where gossip could ruin a reputation overnight, a single rival could destroy everything she had built. And so her desire to eliminate competition was not simply born of jealousy, it was born of survival. In her mind, every woman who looked at the Duke with longing eyes was a threat, a thief waiting to steal what was rightfully hers. To silence them was not cruelty. It was justice, a restoration of the order she believed was owed to her. The rivalry among noblewomen was not limited to hidden glances or cutting remarks. They fought with alliances, using families and factions to strengthen their positions. A woman who won the Duke's heart might also win the political backing of his allies. A woman cast aside might find herself ruined, her family disgraced. These high stakes made every smile sharpened with venom, every dance at a ball a subtle duel. Yet while most women fought with words, the bride began to entertain darker possibilities. The thought of removing rivals permanently, of ensuring they would never again walk into a hall or glance toward the Duke, became not a fantasy, but a plan. In public, she remained the picture of refinement. She played the role expected of her, the dutiful, graceful, elegant lady who embodied everything the court praised. Behind her silk veil, however, she nurtured a seed of ruthlessness. It is in this moment of her life that we begin to see the fracture, the divide between the woman the court adored and the shadow she kept hidden. While others envied her position, no one could guess the lengths she would go to protect it. For in her heart, love was never tender, it was a battlefield. And on this battlefield, there was no room for rivals. The stage was set, a glittering court, a Duke caught between admiration and politics, and a young woman whose beauty disguised her growing obsession. Soon, whispers of rivalry would shift from harmless gossip to something darker, something lethal. For in the bride's mind, victory would never be secured through charm alone. Victory would demand silence, total, permanent silence, from anyone who dared stand in her way. The first death came quietly, almost unnoticed, as though it were just another whisper lost in the echoing halls of the Duke's palace. At first, no one thought much of it. A young woman, one of the many who had once caught the Duke's attention, had vanished. Disappearances were not unheard of in the noble courts. Sometimes a family recalled a daughter in shame. Sometimes scandal forced a sudden retreat into the countryside. And sometimes rivalries pushed a woman to seek opportunities elsewhere. But beneath the surface, this disappearance was different. This was no accident of courtly intrigue, no quiet exile. This was murder, deliberate and intimate, carried out by the very woman who now walked the halls draped in silks and smiles. The victim was no ordinary rival. She was a lady of elegance and charm, admired for her wit as much as for her beauty. Rumors had circulated that the Duke had once been smitten with her, perhaps even tempted to make her his bride. To the new bride, this was unforgivable. The thought that the Duke might still harbor even the faintest affection for another woman gnawed at her like a persistent shadow. In her mind, there was no room for rivals, not even in memory. And so, the young woman was marked. The method of killing was as symbolic as it was brutal. The bride chose a ribbon, soft and delicate, the sort of ornament one might expect to see in a noblewoman's hair or tied around a gift. To the outside world, ribbons were emblems of grace, femininity, and elegance. In her hands, they became weapons. She lured the rival into a private chamber, perhaps under the pretense of reconciliation, perhaps with a smile and a kind word. What followed was not the image of two ladies in conversation, but the terrifying silence of one woman fighting for breath as silk tightened around her throat. Strangulation is a slow death, a death that forces the killer to look into the victim's eyes, to feel every desperate struggle, to hear every broken gasp. It is a death of dominance, of control, and of intimacy. In choosing this method, the bride was not only eliminating her rival. She was asserting ownership, declaring that no other woman could so much as breathe in the same space as the Duke. The rival's desperate hands clawed at the ribbon, her body twisting and fighting, but in the end, strength and fury triumphed over fear. When the final breath left the victim's body, the chamber returned to silence, broken only by the sound of the bride's own heartbeat. Yet killing was not enough. The act itself, though satisfying, left behind a problem: the body. Death in a noble household was not so easily concealed, and though accidents and illnesses were common, strangulation bore its marks too clearly. Bruises on the neck, broken capillaries in the eyes, the unmistakable signs of violence. And so, she relied on the silence of servants, those who cleaned, who looked away, who knew that to speak would mean their own ruin. Fear was her ally, and fear kept tongues from wagging. But even more chilling than her method of concealment was what she chose to take from the victim. With calculated precision, she cut away a lock of hair from the lifeless head. This was no random act of mutilation. In the culture of the time, hair carried meaning. Tokens of love were often exchanged as locks tied with ribbons, symbols of devotion kept close to the heart. To sever the hair of her rival and keep it for herself was not merely a trophy. It was an inversion of that tradition. It was her way of turning the victim into a permanent reminder of conquest, of bending intimacy into something grotesque. The lock of hair was stored away, hidden but cherished. It was the beginning of a ritual, one that would be repeated again and again, each new trophy feeding her hunger. In those strands she saw not just victory, but permanence. The Duke might remember other women with fondness, but she held proof that they were gone, that their lives had ended at her hands, and that she alone remained. To the rest of the court, the young woman's disappearance remained little more than a whisper, another piece of gossip quickly drowned out by new scandals. But beneath the shimmering surface of feasts and dances, the first stain of blood had already seeped in. Those closest to the Duke noticed the change in his bride. Her confidence grew. Her presence seemed to command more authority, as though the removal of one rival had strengthened her resolve. Few dared to question her, and those who did found themselves met with her disarming smile. None suspected the truth, that the ribbons she wore so gracefully could double as instruments of death. The first strangulation was not her last. It was only the opening move in a pattern of violence that would soon leave a trail of bodies in her wake. But it was also the moment in which she crossed the threshold from jealousy to bloodlust, from insecurity to dominance. Once she had felt the power of silencing a rival, of cutting away a piece of her to keep forever, there was no turning back. The bride had tasted what it meant to hold another woman's life in her hands, and in that taste, she discovered a dark addiction. The first death was quiet, but the echoes of it would resound through every chamber of the Duke's palace, growing louder with every corpse that followed. One death could be dismissed as misfortune, a tragedy whispered about behind lace-gloved hands, and quickly buried beneath the swirl of courtly scandal. But when another woman vanished, and then another, a pattern began to form, one that only the most observant dared to notice, and one the bride carefully nurtured. With each disappearance, her methods grew bolder, her confidence sharper, her hunger for control insatiable. The Duke's court, once alive with the laughter of admirers and rivals alike, slowly thinned of female voices that had once threatened her claim. What remained were the silks, the jewels, and the smiling bride who seemed more radiant with each death, as if each strangulation polished her mask of elegance. The victims were varied. Some were noblewomen, wealthy and ambitious, who believed their beauty or family connections might grant them a chance at the Duke's heart. Others were servants, young and pretty, who had drawn the Duke's wandering eye or become the subject of rumor. One was even said to be a courtesan of considerable charm, whose brazen attempt to win the Duke's favor proved to be her undoing. To the bride, the rank of the rival mattered little. Whether highborn or low, whether wrapped in velvet or coarse linen, they were all threats. And threats, in her world, could not be tolerated. Each killing bore the same ritualistic touch. A ribbon slipped around a throat, a silent struggle behind closed doors, and then the quiet snip of scissors severing hair from a cooling corpse. With each trophy she collected, her collection grew, a secret shrine of conquest hidden in boxes and drawers, strands of women who would never again laugh, whisper, or dare to approach the Duke. The bride did not see these trophies as grotesque, but as symbols of triumph, proof of her superiority over all who dared challenge her. In her mind, she was not a murderer. She was a protector, a guardian of her marriage, a woman ensuring her rightful place beside her husband. What made her pattern so chilling was not only her method, but her ability to conceal it. The strict hierarchies of noble households played into her hands. Servants who stumbled upon suspicious sights, a ribbon stained with sweat, a body hastily hidden, were too terrified to speak. In an age when disobedience could mean a beating, dismissal, or worse, no one dared accuse a lady of such high standing. Silence became her ally, fear her accomplice. Each death was smoothed over with excuses, sudden illness, family emergencies, or quiet withdrawals from court. Those who questioned too much were silenced not with ribbons, but with glares, veiled threats, and reminders of their lowly positions. Still, whispers began to ripple. A few sharp-tongued courtiers noticed that the Duke's admirers vanished with uncanny frequency. Bad luck, some murmured. Or perhaps the Duke himself has grown careless with his women. Others speculated that rival families were removing their daughters from danger to avoid scandal. Yet none dared suggest the true culprit. Who could imagine that the bride, the elegant, smiling lady who presided over banquets and charity, was capable of such horrors? The contrast between her public persona and her secret violence was so stark, so unthinkable, that even those closest to the truth could not reconcile the two. Psychologically, the killings revealed a terrifying transformation. What began as acts of jealous desperation hardened into a calculated pattern. She no longer killed only when threatened. At times, she struck simply to reaffirm her control, to remind herself of her own dominance. The strangulations were no longer merely acts of removal, they were acts of possession. In those moments, she was not just protecting her marriage. She was proving her own power, proving that she could silence anyone, bend anyone, and take a part of them to keep forever. With every ribbon pulled taut, she reaffirmed her identity as both bride and conqueror. The bodies left behind told their own silent story. Servants recalled glimpses of bruised throats, of pale hands curled in final struggle, of hair clippings swept hurriedly away. They spoke in hushed tones of how the bride's chambers always smelled faintly of lavender, as if to mask the sour stench of fear that clung to her. A few whispered of boxes they had seen, small and ornate, filled with strands of hair tied neatly in silk ribbons. These whispers were too dangerous to repeat openly, but they simmered in the undercurrent of palace life, building a tension that grew with every disappearance. As the killings multiplied, so too did the bride's audacity. She no longer confined herself to shadowy corners or secluded chambers. At feasts, her rivals would leave to powder their faces or fetch a forgotten item, only to vanish and never return. At dances, her eyes lingered on women too bold with their glances toward the Duke, her smile carrying a silent warning. The court became a place of quiet terror, where beauty was dangerous and admiration of the Duke might be the last mistake a woman ever made. By the time her collection of hair had grown to fill entire boxes, the bride had crossed fully into the realm of obsession. These trophies were not hidden away as shameful secrets, but cherished possessions she would gaze upon in private moments, stroking the strands as if they were precious relics. To her, they were more than reminders of the dead. They were proof of her power, tangible evidence of victories that no one else could ever take from her. In her mind, these women had not simply been killed. They had been erased, reduced to strands of hair woven into her own narrative of supremacy. The court, meanwhile, sank deeper into fear. Some women avoided the duke entirely, pretending indifference, hoping to escape the bride's gaze. Families began withdrawing daughters from court, citing illness or travel, unwilling to risk becoming the next scandal. Yet still, the bride smiled, attended feasts, hosted gatherings, her charm undiminished in public. No one dared confront her, no one dared accuse. And so the deaths continued, silent and steady, until the palace itself seemed cursed. The pattern was now undeniable, even if unspoken. Women who vied for the duke's attention did not simply lose, they disappeared. The bride had transformed jealousy into ritual, rivalry into execution, love into possession. The silk ribbons she wore so gracefully had become instruments of terror, and the locks of hair she collected had become monuments to her reign of silence. With each new victim, the line between beauty and horror blurred further, until they became indistinguishable. And all of it, every trophy, every death, was building toward her ultimate display, a wedding not of romance, but of conquest. The wedding should have been a day of glory, a glittering celebration that cemented the duke's power and displayed his wealth for all to see. Nobles arrived in their finest garments, their jewels catching the light of hundreds of candles, their voices filling the hall with chatter and laughter. The air was thick with perfume and the sweet scent of roses imported at great expense, each petal arranged in ornate garlands that hung from walls and balconies. Musicians played, banners unfurled, and servants hurried through the crowd bearing trays of wine and delicacies. To the casual observer, it was perfection, a union destined to be remembered in song and story. Yet beneath the glittering surface, the celebration was something far more sinister. Hidden among the flowers, woven into the garlands and ribbons, lay strands of human hair. They glimmered faintly under candlelight, unnoticed by most, but each one carried the weight of a life cut short, a rival silenced forever. The bride had planned this moment with precision. To her, the wedding was not merely the fulfillment of ambition, not merely the prize for which she had schemed and killed. It was the ultimate stage, a performance in which she would surround herself with her victories. Every lock of hair she had collected, every trophy taken from the corpses of her rivals, had been carefully preserved for this day. While the duke believed he was marrying a woman whose devotion was unmatched, what he truly married was a monster who had turned her wedding into a shrine of death. The decorations told the story, if only anyone had dared to look closely enough. Strands of hair braided into garlands hung alongside roses, their unusual hues blending with the flowers. Some were woven into ribbons that adorned the bride's gown, giving her attire a subtle shimmer that few could explain. Others were twisted into the stems of bouquets, hidden just beneath the blooms so that every guest who admired the arrangements unknowingly gazed upon fragments of the dead. Perhaps most grotesque of all were the strands that had been worked into the tapestries, delicate enough to escape suspicion but unmistakable to the bride, who knew exactly where each piece had been placed. She walked among them like a queen among trophies, smiling with the satisfaction of a conqueror parading her spoils of war. To those present, the bride was radiant, her beauty magnified by her joy. Her smile was wide, her gestures graceful, her every step seemingly touched by divine favor. Few could have guessed that her joy was not born of love, but of dominance. She was not celebrating a marriage so much as reveling in her own power. The women she had strangled could not attend, could not challenge her, could not so much as whisper in the duke's ear. Their presence lingered only in the decorations, silenced and displayed like ornaments, each one a silent testament to her cruelty. The symbolism of the act was chilling. Hair, long regarded as a token of affection, a keepsake exchange between lovers, had been transformed into a symbol of victory. What should have been cherished as a sign of intimacy was instead displayed as evidence of conquest. Guests who admired the garlands saw only beauty. The bride saw her dominance woven into every corner of the hall. Where others saw roses, she saw the faces of her rivals, their lives reduced to strands that now celebrated her triumph. The ceremony itself unfolded with grandeur. The Duke, oblivious to the true horror surrounding him, spoke vows of devotion. The bride answered with sweetness, her voice steady and sure, as though she had not ended lives to stand at his side. Musicians played triumphant tunes, servants poured wine, and nobles raised their goblets in cheer. Yet for those who stood close enough to the bride, there was something unsettling in her gaze, a flicker of satisfaction too sharp, too deliberate, as though she were savoring a victory no one else could understand. What made the wedding so terrifying was not merely the presence of the trophies, but the audacity of their display. The bride had not hidden her crimes in shadows. She had brought them into the heart of the Duke's palace, daring the world to see them. It was a gesture of defiance, a silent challenge. I have killed, and I will not be stopped. Even in this hall, even on this day, I display what I have done. To anyone perceptive enough to sense it, the message was unmistakable. This was not a union of love, but a coronation of terror. As the banquet unfolded, rumors stirred among the servants, who had always known more than they dared reveal. Some whispered of the strange texture of the garlands, others of the faint smell of perfume masking something less pleasant. A few claimed they had seen the bride gazing at the decorations with a private smile, as though admiring not the flowers but the hidden strands woven within them. None dared speak aloud, but unease hung over the celebration, a shadow beneath the music and laughter. The Duke himself seemed blind to the truth. Perhaps he was enchanted by her beauty, or perhaps willful ignorance shielded him from the whispers that surrounded his bride. To acknowledge the possibility of her guilt would have been to shatter the image of perfection he had so carefully cultivated. And so he celebrated, drank deeply, and basked in the glow of his new marriage, unaware that the very hall in which he stood had been transformed into a mausoleum of his bride's making. For the bride, this was the pinnacle. Every death, every strangulation, every lock of hair had led to this moment. She stood not only as the Duke's wife, but as a victor who had eradicated every rival and displayed their remains in triumph. The wedding decorations were not ornaments, but warnings, silent declarations of her power. She had woven death into beauty, horror into celebration, and no one around her had the courage to call it what it was. This was the wedding of death, a union sealed not only by vows but by blood. While the guests clapped, sang, and raised their goblets, the bride stood at the center of it all, triumphant, her victims surrounding her in silence. The day that should have been remembered for love would instead be remembered, by those who knew the truth, as one of the most grotesque and audacious displays of cruelty in history. And as the last notes of music faded, as the candles burned low, the bride smiled, for she knew she had achieved what she desired most: absolute possession, absolute dominance, and a victory written not in ink or song, but in hair and silence. The first cracks in her perfect facade appeared not in the glittering halls of the wedding feast, but in the shadows of whispered conversations that followed. For all her careful planning, for all her skill in concealment, no reign of terror lasts forever. The same hair she wove into garlands, the same body she concealed through silence and fear, would eventually betray her. What began as murmurs among servants grew into uneasy gossip among courtiers, until suspicion became too loud to ignore. And when the first whispers reached the ears of officials charged with protecting the Duke's household, the bride's kingdom of silence began to crumble. It was a servant who broke first. Terrified, trembling, but unable to carry the burden of what she had seen, she confessed in fragments, about the ribbons, about the bodies hidden in chambers, about the locks of hair stored in ornate boxes. At first, those who heard dismissed her words as fantasy. Who could imagine that the Duke's radiant bride, celebrated across the land for her beauty and grace, was capable of such horrors? Yet when another servant echoed the same story, and then another, the pattern became undeniable. The palace, once filled with reverence for the bride, now quivered with unease. Investigators were dispatched, discreet at first, for such an accusation threatened not only the bride but the Duke's honor as well. They searched her chambers under the guise of routine inspection, What they found chilled them to the bone. Hidden in drawers, locked in jeweled boxes, were the trophies, strands of hair tied neatly with ribbons, some faded, some still bearing the faint scent of oils once used by their owners. Each lock was carefully labeled, a grotesque catalogue of conquest. To hold one was to hold a fragment of a life that had ended violently, a silent testimony to murder. The discovery could not be contained. Words spread quickly, igniting scandal that rippled through every corner of noble society. Guests who had attended the wedding now remembered the strange shimmer of the garlands, the unsettling gleam in the bride's eyes. Stories grew wilder with every telling. That the entire hall had been decorated with the hair of the dead, that her gown itself had been stitched with the strands of her victims, that she had whispered vows not to her husband, but to the ghosts of the women she had destroyed. Whether truth or exaggeration, the effect was the same. Horror consumed her reputation, and the once adored bride became a figure of dread. The trial that followed was unlike any other of its age. To put a noblewoman, and the wife of a duke no less, on public display for crimes so grotesque threatened to unravel the very fabric of aristocratic honor. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Servants testified, their voices trembling as they recounted the screams, the bruises, the lifeless bodies dragged away in silence. Some described seeing her hands linger too long on a rival's hair, caressing it as though imagining it already severed. Others spoke of nights when laughter echoed from her chambers, though she was alone, surrounded only by her trophies. The bride herself remained composed, at least at first. She denied everything with poise, her voice calm, her expression unyielding. To many, it was difficult to reconcile the elegance of her demeanor with the horrors described. But as testimony piled up, as boxes of hair were laid before the court, her mask began to slip. In rare moments, witnesses later said, her eyes would flash with something sharp and unrepentant, as though she were not ashamed but defiant. She was not merely accused of murder. She was accused of desecrating the sanctity of love and marriage, of turning the very symbols of beauty into instruments of horror. The public devoured every detail. Pamphlets circulated with lurid illustrations, depicting the bride strangling rivals with ribbons, weaving garlands of hair, standing triumphant among corpses. Crowds gathered outside the trial, shouting curses, prayers, and demands for justice. In taverns and marketplaces, her story became legend, part truth, part invention, all monstrous. She was no longer a noblewoman. She was a specter, a cautionary tale whispered to daughters about the dangers of envy and unchecked ambition. The Duke himself faced humiliation. To admit that his bride had been a murderer was to admit blindness, folly, and weakness. Some said he knew all along, but chose silence to protect his pride. Others argued he was truly deceived, a victim of her manipulation as much as her rivals had been. Regardless, his reputation suffered. The court that had once celebrated his wedding now sneered behind his back, mocking the man who had wed a killer and allowed her to parade death through his halls. The sentence, when it came, was severe, though historians disagree on the exact details. Some accounts claim she was executed publicly, her hair shorn before the crowd, the very symbol of her power stripped away before her final breath. Others suggest she was locked away in a convent or prison, hidden from the world to protect the Duke's honor, her name erased from official records. What is certain is that her reign of silence ended, and the palace slowly returned to uneasy normalcy. Yet the memory lingered. Her trial was not merely a reckoning for her crimes, but a reflection of society's deepest fears. That a woman, expected to embody purity, obedience, and grace, could instead become a monster of ambition and blood unsettled the foundations of patriarchal order. She was painted not only as a murderer, but as an unnatural creature, a warning of what happens when desire and jealousy escape the boundaries imposed on women. In demonizing her, the court sought not only to punish her, but to restore the illusion of control. And still, the image endured. A bride standing in a hall decorated with roses and ribbons, each garland woven with strands of the dead. No trial, no sentence, no attempt to erase her name could silence that vision. It was too powerful, too haunting. She had turned a wedding, the purest of unions, into a theater of horror. and for that, her story would live on long after her body had been silenced. Her story did not end with her death or confinement. Like a shadow cast across the centuries, the legend of the Duke's deadly bride lingered long after the candles of her wedding had burned out. What made her tale so enduring was not only the brutality of her crimes, but the grotesque beauty of her symbolism. In an age that celebrated love and loyalty in rituals of hair and ribbon, she had twisted those same tokens into weapons, leaving behind a memory that could not be erased by official records or family silence. Though the court tried to bury her name, though chroniclers sought to protect the Duke's honor by striking her from their histories, the whispers survived. And whispers, repeated often enough, become legends. For some, she became a monster in the truest sense, an embodiment of female jealousy unleashed, a warning tale to be told to daughters about the dangers of envy, ambition, and disobedience. Moralists of the time painted her as a cautionary figure, proof that women must be contained, guided, and kept from power lest their passions consume them. She was invoked in sermons and whispered in convent halls, her story stripped of nuance and sharpened into a parable of unnatural femininity. In this version, she was less a woman than a demon, a creature who had traded grace for blood, beauty for cruelty. Yet others, in later centuries, found her story more complex. Was she truly mad, consumed by a pathological obsession with possession? Or was she a product of a society that left women no tools but beauty and marriage to secure their futures? In a world where her entire worth was measured by her ability to captivate and hold the attention of a powerful man, perhaps her violence was a warped expression of desperation. She could not wield armies, she could not command estates, she could not negotiate like a duke, but she could strangle, she could silence, she could ensure that no rival remained to challenge her. For some historians, she was less a monster and more a mirror, reflecting the brutal realities of a system that gave her no other means of survival. The legacy of her crimes also haunted the Duke. His name, once celebrated, became entangled with hers in every retelling. No ballad praised his marriage without a shudder, no record of his reign escaped the stain of her scandal. In some accounts, he was cast as the fool, blinded by beauty, tricked into wedlock with a killer. In others, he was complicit, choosing to ignore the whispers because to confront them would have meant acknowledging his failure. Either way, his honor never fully recovered. Where once his wedding was meant to cement his greatness, it instead became a monument to infamy. And then there is the hair, that most haunting of details. Hair does not decay quickly. Locks cut from the head can survive for centuries, outlasting flesh and bone. In that truth lies a disturbing thought. Perhaps some of her trophies endured, hidden away in forgotten boxes, passed quietly through hands, stripped of their history but never of their horror. To imagine those strands still existing somewhere, woven into fabric, preserved in trunks, is to imagine the dead reaching into the present. It is this image, the garlands of human hair draped across a wedding hall, that keeps her story alive. Even when stripped of names and dates, the symbol itself is unforgettable. Her legacy belongs not only to history, but to folklore. Tales of murderous brides, of women who strangle rivals and keep tokens of their deaths, echo through European legends and Gothic literature. In many of these, one can trace the shadow of the Duke's bride. Whether she was remembered by name or not, her image seeped into cultural memory, shaping archetypes of the Black Widow, the deadly woman whose love is inseparable from death. Her story was retold in whispers, exaggerated, reshaped, but never lost. And so we are left with the question that haunts every retelling. Was she driven by madness, by obsession, by the crushing weight of a world that reduced her to beauty and marriage? Or was she simply a predator, reveling in dominance, intoxicated by the power to kill and collect? Perhaps the answer lies in the silence of her victims, in the hair that once belonged to women who had dreams, families, futures, all reduced to ornaments in her grotesque theater. Her tale forces us to confront the thin veil that separates love from possession, beauty from horror, devotion from obsession. It asks us to look at the symbols we cherish, ribbons, garlands, locks of hair, and consider how easily they can be twisted into something dark. The Duke's bride may be gone, her body silenced by justice or exile. But her story endures because it embodies the truth we fear most, that beneath the silks and smiles, even in the most celebrated halls of power, darkness can thrive. And so, when we remember the wedding draped in roses and ribbons, we cannot help but see what lay hidden among them. The trophies of the dead, displayed in plain sight, and the bride who smiled as she claimed them. Hers is not merely a story of murder. It is a legacy of terror, woven into history like strands of hair into garlands, impossible to untangle, impossible to forget.